Good afternoon, all, and welcome to a special Center for Applied GIScience virtual seminar held jointly with the Department of Geography and Earth Sciences speaker series. Please be aware that this seminar is being recorded. If you are new to us, the Center for Applied GIS, often called CAGIS, is an applied research center affiliated with the Department of Geography. At CAGIS, we apply geospatial methods and technologies to better understand pressing multi-scale urban and environmental issues. One of our areas of interest is that of the smart city, the idea that place-based automation and digital services can improve the lives of city residents. In the last decade and a half, advances in communication and computing technologies have dramatically changed our relationships with cities and place in general. That cell phone in our pocket, in many ways, is a window into another country. Many of us can remember the novelty of being in both a digital space and a physical space at the same time. I'm reminded of the time my partner and I were in the wine aisle trying to pick a bottle, and I look over and see her vigorously pounding her cell phone. I went over to see what was the matter and realized that she was battling another Pokemon trainer. It turns out that we were in a digital space, a Pokemon gym, as well as a physical space, a market, and she was grappling with some colorful avatar, who knows where, while I tried to pick a Pinot Noir. It was kind of irritating, actually. However, accessing a hybrid digital physical space, sometimes understood as the metaverse, requires a unique and potentially paradigm-changing geography. And trying to understand that geography is what led us to today's speaker. Dr. Shih-Lung Shah is Chancellor's professor and Alvin and Sally Beaman Professor of Geography at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. His research interests covered GIS for transportation, space-time GIS, time geography, transportation planning, and human dynamics. Dr. Shah is an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancements of Science and recipient of the Edward L. Ullman Award for outstanding contributions to transportation geography and Outstanding Scholar Award in Regional Development and Planning from the American Association of Geographers. He currently serves as president-elect of the University Consortium for Geographic Information Science and is an editor of Springer's Human Dynamics in Smart Cities book series. He has also served as interim associate provost for the international education and head of the Department of Geography at the University of Tennessee. Dr. Shah's presentation is titled A SpacePlace GIScience Framework for Human Dynamic Research in a Hybrid Physical Virtual World. Please welcome Dr. Shah.
Thank you very much for the nice introduction, Doug, and also thank you for the invitation to share some of my thoughts with you today. Let me share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you can all see the title page. Yeah, good. So also thank you all for attending this virtual seminar on a Friday afternoon, also on April Fool's Day. Okay, one benefit of giving a presentation on April Fool's Day is if you find anything wrong in my presentation, I can just say, haha, it's an April Fool's joke. Okay, so that can, be more relaxed, okay, in terms of talking about this topic. So in this title, there are three sets of key words. One is SpacePlace GIScience Framework. The second set is human dynamics. And the third one is hybrid physical virtual world. And Doug just shared us with with a good story like Pokemon Go really is a combination of physical space and virtual space using augmented reality technology. So I hope I can contribute something to this topic. Okay, so let's get started. Back in 1995, Max Angenhofer and David Mark, they co-published NCGIA, National Center for Geographic Information and Analysis report on naive geography, almost 30 years ago. And they suggested that naive geography can capture and reflect the way people think and reason about geographic space and time. So they also argued that naive geography can be the basis for the design of intelligent GIS that will act and respond as a person would. So to those of us who have been working with GIS for some time, are we there yet? Do we have an intelligent GIS that acts and responds as a person would? In my humble opinion, unfortunately, I think GIS today, they are still far away from acting and responding as humans would. So why and how can we make it better? So I think at least part of the reason that we are not there yet is because conventional GIS have followed the traditional cartographic approach to represent locations in physical space as static map layers, like the diagram shows on this slide. And this is very much based on the Newtonian absolute space concept. And we have been using methods such as Euclidean geometry and the Cartesian coordinate system to implement the conventional GIS. So I would argue that this particular conceptualization of space as Newtonian absolute space has major limitations of considering humans in GIS. In other words, this conceptualization of space as Newtonian absolute space is good, but it's not sufficient to deal with human dynamics, especially in a hybrid physical virtual world. So then, what do I mean by human dynamics? We human beings have all kinds of needs. We need to eat, we need to sleep, we need to rest as part of our physiological needs. We need to go to work to earn income, okay, for economic reasons. We need to social with our families, friends, and etc. to fulfill our social needs. And also we go grocery shopping. Every once in a while, we go to see a doctor in order to fulfill different needs in our daily lives. So on the right-hand side, that's an example of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So starts from the bottom, those basic needs, food, water, warmth, rest, all the way up to the self-fulfillment needs, okay? So then human dynamics, in my context, it covers all kinds of human activities and interactions, which are used to fulfill the different human needs in a space and the time context. So we carry out different kinds of activities and the interactions in both physical space and virtual space in order to fulfill those different needs. So the modern technologies, especially the so-called information and the communication technologies such as the internet or these mobile smart devices, they have significantly changed human dynamics in a now increasingly hybrid physical virtual world. So for example, we have been using transportation to move among different locations in physical space. But today, increasingly, we are using ICT to navigate among different places in virtual space. So now, at this moment, we are on Zoom. But next moment, we can switch to Facebook, to Google, to some other places in the virtual space. Okay, and also another important thing we need to remember is what happens in physical space. They are not independent from what takes place in virtual space. They actually influence and are influenced with each other with all these interactions between them. So on top of that, we also need to keep in mind, we humans are dynamic and living entities. We are not static at fixed locations. So we navigate in both physical and virtual spaces to carry out various activities and interactions in order to meet our various needs. Okay. So Michael Beatty, back in 1997, published an article of virtual geography in Futures. And he suggested that different virtual forms have their own sense of place and space. In other words, their own geography. He also argues that what is crystal clear is that the future subject matter and the method of geography will be very different as place and the space and time itself become virtual in an age where the digital permeates all human activity. I would argue that we are in this age now, which is a hybrid physical virtual world that Michael Beatty envisioned almost 30 years ago to promote virtual geography. So there can be many different forms of a hybrid physical virtual world. Digital twin and metaverse, there are two examples of a hybrid physical virtual world. So I will use them as examples before I get into the SpacePlace GIScience framework. So digital twin usually consists of three components. One is a physical product in the physical world, and the two, a virtual representation of that physical product. And the third, bidirectional data connections that will feed data from the physical side to the virtual representation, and also information and the processes from the virtual representation to the physical, okay? And IBM defined a digital twin as a virtual representation of an object or system that spans its life cycle, is updated from real-time data, and uses simulation, machine learning, and reasoning to help decision-making. So this can be one example of a hybrid physical virtual world. In a digital twin environment, simply it's possible we deal with these two entities, one physical product, one virtual representation separately, okay? Or we build interactions between them. Metaverse simply is a term that are still quite elusive and puzzles many people. But in general, we can understand Metaverse as a future version of today's internet applications, okay? Like this Zoom meeting, okay? But will be in a somewhat different format with a virtual world that is increasingly intertwined with the physical world. In other words, it can become harder and harder to separate the physical world and the virtual world with the interactions between them. And recently, there have been some very interesting developments in the metaverse world I will share with you in the next few slides. So metaverse could further change human dynamics in many aspects, especially when the technologies that support metaverse become more user-friendly. For example, if this cumbersome virtual reality headsets can be replaced by lightweight eyeglasses. That will make it much easier, okay? And also, it will take some time before the market becomes more mature and can attract many users, okay? So I'm not trying to say Metaverse is going to be the future that will dominate the world, but this is one example that could further change human dynamics in a hybrid physical virtual world, okay? So this is an article in Forbes published in January this year, just about 2 months ago. And it's about the future of the metaverse, what 2022 has in store for the immersive digital world. So in this article, certainly we know metaverse, this term was first coined in a 1992 science fiction novel of Snow Crash by Neil Stephenson. And this term became very popular last year because Facebook decided to rebrand itself and rename its parent company as Meta Platform Inc., or for short as Meta. And it's trying to rebrand Facebook as the next chapter of the internet, okay? But you know, this concept of metaverse remains somewhat elusive to many people, okay? And also, it's going to take some time for the technologies and for the market to develop. And also, it's going to require these companies invest a significant amount of money on the platform. So, but if metaverse becomes widely accepted in our daily lives, then it can change many things. For example, the future of work can be redefined by metaverse. Now, if you Google, you will find NVIDIA already developed a so-called Omniverse enterprise. And Facebook has developed the so-called Meta Horizon workrooms. And Microsoft has the so-called Mesh. And they are all designed to empower work in a virtual world. And they enable remote collaboration across different devices through the so-called mixed reality applications. In addition to work environment, metaverse also can change school and social life, okay? And also the business world can function quite differently if metaverse becomes widely used in our societies, okay? So what is a metaverse? There are quite a few metaverse platforms, commercial platforms out there. This is one example by a company called Sandbox, okay? So they created this land in virtual space. And we all can buy a piece of land of different sizes in this metaverse. For example, you can see Warner Music Group bought a piece of land, and Atari and many others already purchased this virtual land in metaverse and started their businesses interactions in metaverse, okay? And interestingly, if you pay attention to here, they even give a location, the XY coordinates to each piece of land in metaverse, like we do in conventional GIS, okay? And in order to allow transactions in a metaverse, they also developed the so-called NFT Marketplace. NFT stands for non-fungible token, which is a non-interchangeable unit of data stored on a blockchain that can uniquely identify any property in virtual space. For example, in terms of a piece of digital art, and why people would be willing to pay big money to buy a piece of digital art that can be easily copied. Who knows which one is the original piece? And the NFT can help you uniquely identify this. So this solves some concerns in this virtual market. Okay, this is another article in Fortune published in December last year, a few months ago. And the title is Conquering the Metaverse: 3 Ways That Businesses Can Find Real Customers in Virtual Worlds. So which companies are actually using Metaverse now? And it says, I don't know, maybe a little bit too small on your screen, but it says there's a reason the Collins Dictionary declared NFT the 2021 Word of the Year, and the Metaverse made its annual shortlist. Because many companies, from luxury ones such as Gucci to mass market companies such as Coca-Cola and the Wendy's, Hamburger, they have been rushing to create or use the Metaverse. So these big companies, they are at least experimenting operations in Metaverse, okay? And also, what happened late last year, a plot of digital land in Decentraland, which is another Metaverse platform, sold a piece of property for 2.3 million at a price level higher than the price of the average real-world Manhattan apartment. That's amazing. In Metaverse virtual world, a piece of property was sold at a price level higher than the average price of Manhattan apartment. Okay, so there are something going on in Metaverse. So my question is GIS and the GIScience ready for human dynamics in an increasingly hybrid physical virtual world, including if we want to develop the so-called smart cities, okay, which definitely will be a hybrid physical virtual world. So a hybrid physical virtual world can bring up new challenges to us in GIS and GIScience. For example, if we ask, what is the location of Google, or the location of Amazon, or the location of Twitter, if we want to represent them in a GIS, what would you do? Okay, so if we take Google as example, certainly the location of Google could be represented by the coordinates of its headquarters in Mountain View, California. That's the location in absolute space. But in the meantime, we could use the URL of Google websites, for example, google.com if you are in the United States, or google.co.uk in the United Kingdom. And the URL will be different in different countries. So we could also use that to represent Google in virtual space. Or we could use the IP address of Google servers, okay? And the IP address could be tied to a physical location in absolute space, or just use it in virtual space. Or we simply treat Google as an identity, and it can be represented by any of those references, okay? So as we move into a physical virtual world, the conventional thinking in geographic information systems probably also need to be revisited, okay? Okay, that brought us to SpacePlace, or we call it Spatial GIScience Framework for Human Dynamics in a Hybrid Physical Virtual World. This article was published in the Annals of the AAG, American Associations of Geographers, in 2020. So in this framework, the diagram on the right-hand side, we put humans at the center of the framework instead of locations as the center in conventional GIS. And we consider humans as dynamic and living objects. Then, in addition to the concept of absolute space that is commonly used in conventional GIS, we also bring in other concepts of space, which are relative space, relational space, and the mental space. In addition to these four concepts of space, we also try to integrate the different concepts of place, because in GIS, people have been working on the so-called place-based or spatial GIS for several years, okay? So we coupled those different concepts of space with different concepts of place. And these four concepts of place are location that goes with absolute space, locale coupled with relative space, place identity with relational space, and the sense of place with mental space. We also have a circle connecting them together. That means these different concepts of space and place, they are not independent from each other. Again, they interact with each other, okay? So I'm going to explain this framework in a little bit more details using the next several slides, okay? So let's start from the absolute space. Absolute space is the foundation of conventional GIS that has served many, many useful applications. So we are not arguing that we need to abandon the concept of absolute space or the concept of location. They are still very, very important and will remain very useful to many applications. But just if we are limited by this particular concept of space and this particular concept of place, they probably will not be sufficient to handle different types of human dynamics in a hybrid physical virtual world, okay? So the next one will be relative space, okay? Let's say, for example, if we are navigating inside the building, how many of you are using the concepts of XYZ coordinates in absolute space when you navigate inside the building? Probably not many of us, right? Those are tied to the concepts of location and site. Instead, relative locations and the surrounding environment inside the building that are tied to the concepts of locale, situation, context, probably are more intuitive to us, human beings. So if we look at the two diagrams down the bottom, the right-hand side one, an ape on a smartphone with augmented reality technology shows the surrounding environment, the relative space, your surrounding environment, the context to navigate you inside the building, probably is more intuitive than the traditional navigation system ape on the left-hand side, okay? So that's one example of relative space, why it can be useful. Another example is autonomous vehicles that has become a popular topic in recent years, especially in transportation. So we simply would like to make GIS useful to autonomous vehicle operations, especially in smart societies, smart cities. But let's ask, what is the positional accuracy of GIS database required to support autonomous vehicle operations in a smart city environment, for example? We all know that the current in-vehicle navigation systems, the positional accuracy is roughly around 10 to 15 meters. Simply, that's not good enough for autonomous vehicles. And we could say at least the positional accuracy needs to be accurate to individual traffic lanes, which means 3 to 5 meters. But how about parking, especially in big cities? then we are talking about a positional accuracy requirement of 5 to 10 centimeters, for example. So the question is it feasible to build a global GIS database at a positional accuracy level of 5 to 10 centimeters? Technically, the answer is yes, okay? But even we can build one, how often can we update it to support autonomous vehicle operations? Even though we can update it at a high cost very frequently, but we need to keep in mind all these vehicles, pedestrians, bicycles, they keep moving around. They are not static. So the absolute locations in an absolute space approach is not going to work to support autonomous vehicle operations alone, okay? But in the meantime, we know all those autonomous vehicles, they are equipped with all kinds of sensors that can be accurate down to millimeter accuracy levels. So in order to address the problem we discussed in the previous slide, all we need to do is to integrate the absolute locations in GIS with relative locations of the surrounding objects collected by these monitors of autonomous vehicles. Then problems can be addressed without having to build a 3 centimeter global GIS database to support this. Okay, so that also shows a benefit of incorporating the concept of relative space and the concept of locale into the framework. The next example for relative space is we have been in this COVID pandemic for quite a while. At the beginning, okay, contact tracing was widely used, and those contact tracing apps were based on the GPS technology, collecting our absolute locations in absolute space. That raised a lot of geo-privacy, geo-ethic concerns among people in the society. So that's why Google and Apple, they really cooperated with each other, but they teamed up to develop this app based on Bluetooth technology. So what is a key difference between GPS and Bluetooth? GPS is based on location in absolute space, but Bluetooth is based on relative locations in relative space. So that removes or reduces some concerns about privacy issues and ethical issues. So that can be another example of the benefits we can gain from the relative space concept. Okay, next, relational space. Social networks, this Zoom meeting, online shopping, they are all examples of relational space. And in a relational space, the focus is on topological relations and the individual identity or place identity rather than absolute locations. And these relations can exist in both physical space and virtual space, like our social networks can be in both physical space and virtual space, and they also interact with each other. So here is one example we developed many years ago. This was published in Journal of Transport Geography back in 2009. We built an extension on top of ArcGIS back then to show how we can link relational space with absolute space together using TimeGPR concepts. So each red line you see here is known as a space-time path from TimeGPR. In other words, that's the trajectory of a person across space and over time. And a gray line you see here represents a physical entity, such as a library, a restaurant. If you see a gate on a gray line, that means that facility was closed during that time period. You cannot access it. And the blue lines here they reflect the different virtual entities in virtual space, like Zoom, like Facebook, like Amazon.com. For example, when you see 3 red lines with a blue line, that can be a room meeting between 3 different people at 3 different locations using a virtual entity of Zoom. So this example shows how we can integrate the concepts of relational space and absolute space together in a GIS environment. Okay? And then mental space. Mental space, the focus is on the mental and the cognitive aspects of humans. And for example, I did a search of Chinatown in New York City using Google Maps last year. And Google Maps returns the boundary line for Chinatown in New York City. At the same time, I used the same keyword to do the same search, but this time using OpenStreetMap. OpenStreetMap also returned a boundary for Chinatown in New York City. But if you compare these 2 polygons, they are quite different. So which one is correct? There's no defined boundary of Chinatown in New York City. The boundary is perceived by different people differently. Also, the boundary evolves over time. So this particular representation of Chinatown in New York City as a place might not be a very good representation for a place like Chinatown. And you can find similar examples on Google Maps and the OpenStreetMap, okay, in many, many cases. Okay? So another example about mental space, getting back to autonomous vehicles. Let's say now you are trying to cross a street and the car stopped with engine running. So you look at the driver of that car, you notice that the driver is sleeping. So how many of you would feel comfortable crossing the street in front of this car with engine running and the driver in sleep? Please raise your hand if you feel comfortable of walking across the street in front of this car with engine running while the driver is in sleep. That's an autonomous vehicle. Okay. Stanford University actually did an experiment, and many people walked behind the car to cross the street. Why? If you think about yourself, when you cross a street in this situation, what do? You try to get eye contact with the driver. That eye contact indicates it's safe. The driver sees you, you can cross in front of the car. So how can we address this issue? Probably all we need to do is to flash the light, indicating I see you, okay? Or, a digital sign says, please cross safely, okay? So that indicates the car, okay, knows you are trying to cross the street. So all we need to consider is autonomous vehicle and human communications and interactions. So a simple solution can address this kind of problem that conventional GIS, under the absolute space probably cannot fully address it. Another example related to autonomous vehicle is like we often run into these construction zones when we drive, and a worker will hold a stop sign. And in terms of technology, there's no problem to these autonomous vehicles to recognize the stop sign and stop. Okay, they are smart enough to recognize stop sign and stop. But then interesting situation could happen. So we said, now I go and order, say, 100 t-shirts online and have this identical stop sign printed both on the front and on the back of those 100 t-shirts. Then I give these 100 t-shirts free to students at the UNC Charlotte. And the only requirement is you need to wear them and walk around on the streets in Charlotte. What could happen? They could cause all kinds of traffic problems in Charlotte. So that's the mental space part, okay? Beyond locations in absolute space. Okay, so with those examples, let me summarize these 4 types of space. So absolute space works with absolute locations in space, and we focus on questions such as where are the different objects? Relative space works with relative locations with respect to either a fixed or a moving object. And we focus on questions such as what are around us. And the relational space works with relations to other objects, and we focus on questions such as what are related to us in our surrounding environment. And the mental space works with the cognitive and the mental aspects of space, and we focus on questions such as what are people thinking? So that's about the 4 concepts of space. I will quickly go over the concepts of place, then put them together to wrap up. So in terms of the concept of place, Yifu Tuan certainly is a famous geographer from humanistic perspective. So Yifu Tuan indicates that place is an area in a space that humans have given meaning to it. For example, the location of UNC Charlotte campus 100 years ago, there was no UNC Charlotte. So it was not known as UNC Charlotte. So UNC Charlotte was created through human activities and then experienced by people to give meaning to that particular location as a place now known as UNC Charlotte. Okay, so place is a social construction that is unique to particular people, and it can vary, change, evolve over time. Paul Adams also indicates that the 3 meta approaches that could be parsed as place as location, place as experience, and place as contested terrain. So for example, place as location that is closely tied to the conventional spatial analysis approach in geography, like the conventional GIS. Place as experience that is more closely tied to humanistic approach in geography, like Yifu Tuan. And the place as contested terrain probably is closely tied to like critical theory in geography. And Paul Adams says the essence of place is its ability to synthesize these multiple characteristics. Just like in GIS, it's not which concept of space or which concept of place is better than other concepts. We probably need all of them in order to address different challenges and different problems we are facing in this hybrid physical virtual world. Okay, and then John Agnew also proposed 3 dimensions for the concept of place, which are location that refers to a site in space where an activity or object is located. So in GIS, this can be defined by XY coordinates or latitude, longitude. And the second dimension of place is locale, which refers to settings where everyday life activities take place. That's the environment, the surrounding environment, the context that something happens. So this can be defined by the physical environmental context or social, economic, cultural context from those different GIS map layers, okay, to reflect the context, the locale. And the sense of place refers to identification with a place as a unique community, landscape, and moral order. So this is tied to human subjective perception attachment to a particular location or locale, okay? And we could use other methods to represent it in GIS. So now let me put them together. different concepts of space and different concepts of place in our framework. So in our framework, absolute space concept is associated with the concept of location for place. And this suggests a specific position or site. And we can easily represent coordinates using the conventional GIS, locations in absolute space. So conventional GIS is still useful, important. And the concept of locale is closely related to relative space. In other words, our attention now focuses mainly on the situation rather than the site, the context of an object, okay, the surrounding environment. And when we deal with relational space, the focus now shifts to place identity. In a relational space, because it's mainly based on topological relations rather than absolute locations. So identity among different places or different individuals, different people, for example, in online social networks, becomes more critical in a relational network. Okay? Finally, mental space is associated with the place concept of sense of place. And we attempt to reflect what people have in mind about a particular location, a particular locale, or a place identity that are associated with those different concepts of space. Okay, so that wraps up the whole thing. Back to the framework. That's why we put humans at the center and consider humans as dynamic living objects. And we incorporate 4 concepts of space: absolute space, relative space, relational space, mental space, coupled with 4 concepts of place, which are location, locale, place identity, and the sense of place in this framework. And also the circles there, the links there are to indicate that they are not isolated from each other. They interact with each other in our daily life. So that summarizes the framework with a few concluding remarks. So we hope this human-centered SpacePlace GIScience framework is more intuitive and natural to human thinking. In other words, closer to the naive geography that Eigenhofer and David Mark proposed almost 30 years ago, that can serve as the basis or a guide for the design of the next generation and more intelligent GIS. Also, we hope this framework can make GIS and GIScience more relevant and useful to researchers, not just in geography, but also in the humanities and other social sciences. And we also hope this framework can better support human dynamics research in a hybrid, increasingly hybrid physical virtual world. Finally, this framework will require additional work to improve and implement it. So we look forward to more people joining this effort with us. So with that, I appreciate your attention and participation in this webinar. And I welcome any questions, comments, and suggestions you have. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. I just want to say right off the bat that I have an appreciation for how you've taken a complex topic and laid it out so I could simply understand it. So thank you so much for that talk. It was really useful.
Thank you.
We have a chat, or people can just kind of pop up if they have any questions. Are there any questions out there?
I'll ask a question. Hi, thank you very much, Dr. Shaw, for the really fascinating presentation. I teach a spatial thinking course, and I have several of my students look like are in the meeting. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the kinds of collaborations that you see that this framework might inform in the future, and maybe with particular attention to practical applications, or maybe, you know, what the next generation of GIS interface or, you know, education looks like.
Great. Thank you very much, Catherine. Yes, I've been looking for good use cases to help illustrate how this framework can be implemented and become useful. Okay. For example, I think smart city, or in a more focused topic, can be just smart transportation. Okay, and we could use it. Climate change. Okay, simply it's closely related to different kinds of human dynamics. Okay, and also, if we want to reduce, for example, carbon emission. Okay, and the combination of activities and the interactions in physical space and virtual space probably can help address some of the challenges we have. Okay, so I have been looking for collaborators in terms of applying this framework to a specific concrete use case to address some important challenges in the real world. And I really welcome, okay, any ideas and suggestions you may have. So for example, I've been working with a faculty member in our history department over the last few years. And next week, we are going to co-sponsor, we are going to host a in-person seminar with a professor from University of Washington talking about humanistic GIS. And we also recently submitted an NSF proposal to try to tackle, for example, in terms of science development, okay, how the different individuals or different institutions, they come up with these nice, innovative ideas or something to move the science forward. So in the past, for example, if we read most of the reports, it's based on the number of publications, the amount of grant money each person or each institution receives. And so, but we feel that doesn't reflect the whole story, because now with the technologies, the research collaboration has been happening in virtual space more and more. So how can we actually consider these interactions to assess science development? Then, we probably will come up with different indicators, different ways of assessing what is important to the entire science community. So I don't know if that answered your question, Catherine.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. And now I'm thinking about that in relation to the academic pursuit too. So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, for example, we already developed an app. Now many of us have been using Google Scholar, right? Or Web of Science, these different tools to try to find who has published what and has received what kinds of grants. But if you try different apps, you get different results, just like Google Map for Chinatown in New York City and OpenStreetMap for Chinatown in New York City. And we have developed a nice tool. We have not made it public. We have made it available to some colleagues on our campus. We can actually pull from all of them, integrate them together, okay? So, in terms of these kinds of things, then we can really do something differently. Yeah, and a lot of my colleagues, when they first saw our application, and they say, this is an underestimate, okay? Because if we, for example, we try to find out our H index from Web of Science, it's going to be different from the H index from Google Scholar. Most of us like Google Scholar better. Why is that?
Easy.
because not just Google Scholar is easier, also because Google Scholar covers more data sources, more references. So in general, our H index is a little bit higher from Google Scholar than from the Web of Science. Yeah. So, if we can compare all these, then can give us a better picture.
Very good. We've got a question from one of our PhD students here at GIS, Tianyang. Could you give some examples to explain what are relative space and relational space?
Okay, good. So obviously I didn't do a good job in my presentation. So for example, in my presentation for relative space, I used autonomous vehicle as an example. Okay, so if we use absolute locations in absolute space to build a GIS database to support autonomous vehicle operations, it will require very, very high positional accuracy level. That's going to be too time consuming and too costly to build and to maintain. But if we integrate the absolute locations in our GIS database at a lower accuracy level with all of the relative locations collected by the sensors on our autonomous vehicles, then the problem can be easily addressed without spending a lot of money and the time to build a GIS database at a higher positional accuracy level. Also, that Google and the Apple app for contact tracing during the pandemic, switching from GPS to Bluetooth. That's pretty much conceptually switching from locations in absolute space to relative locations in relative space. So that can address and or help reduce the geo-privacy and geoethical concerns. And the relational space, just like now, we are joining together through Zoom at this virtual webinar. And we are all connected with each other in a virtual space. So that connection can be represented as a network in a relational space. And in GIS, there have been many, many articles, for example, using Twitter, okay, data and other kinds of social media data to analyze the relationships among different people, okay? And that's actually based on the concept of a relational space instead of absolute space. I hope I have answered your question. If not, it's April Fool's Day.
Well, I think you did a good job. You got a thanks from Tianyang. So I have a comment. It's more of a comment than a question. I was thinking about how many, so where each of these types of space can be thought of as sort of a new dimensionality, right? And I was trying to think about how we handle multi-dimensional information, right? And I came up with two sorts of, so in trying to think of a use case, I came up with two ways that I know of dealing with multi-dimensionality. Mm-hmm. And one is ignorance, right? So my wife playing Pokemon Go is able to, what in the humanities they would call suspend her disbelief and forget she was in a market, but actually sort of pretend that she was in another space fighting, right? Mm-hmm. And so in order to deal with the dimensionality, and a sort of enforced ignorance would have to be employed, or some sort of screening or limitation in order to be, so that's one aspect. And then the other thought was using things like PCA, principal component analysis, right? And building your data clouds and then choosing what axis you'll slice that cloud or using eigenvector analysis to try to figure out what the most powerful axes are, right? So anyway, I didn't really have a question there, but it's got me thinking about how you would actually use a data stack that would include these different representations of geography?
Thank you, Doug. Excellent question. I also see a follow-up in the chat box. Let me answer that question first. The question is, then relative space is physical, relational space is virtual? Not necessarily, okay? Relational space also can be in physical space, like our friends network in physical space, okay? So relative space, okay, conceptually, you can expand it. For example, if we talk about cities, okay, say Charlotte. Charlotte is not just connected to the different cities next to it, okay, in physical space. Charlotte, more importantly, is connected in virtual space through trade, through the telecommunication contact, through the finance, okay, with many other places around the world, okay? So, you know, so in other words, relative space and relational space, they can also overlap and interact with each other. So I just want to clarify that first. Then getting back to your multidimensional challenge, yes. When I first worked on TimeGPR, trying to develop a space-time GIS, and I ran into this challenge. So if we try to represent it on a computer screen, the best we can do is 3-dimensional, okay, or 2.5 dimensional, realistically. And so then how can we deal with all these different concepts of space and the concepts of place? For example, Helen Kukulis at UC Santa Barbara, she published an article, I don't remember the year, but many years ago, trying to talk about this virtual and the physical world. And she also suggested that we can use parallel plots, okay? Those kind of things similar to the principal components, these kind of ideas. But I think we can even go beyond all these classical statistical methods. So for example, if I ask one question, why do we teach story map in GIS? Why Esri has been promoting story map over the years? Why is that? The answer to me is very simple. Because conventional GIS, including ArcGIS Desktop, ArcGIS Pro, cannot tell the full story. So in other words, we can use narratives, we can use videos, we can use photos, we can use all of these to help us address other concepts, including mental space and the sense of space. So that is what we are doing. We are currently developing an operational prototype system to implement that framework.
Splendid. That's a great answer. Unless there's any other questions, I think it's about time we tie this up. Thanks again so much. We're greatly appreciative, and I, for one, learned a lot.
Thank you very much for attending this webinar on Friday afternoon, and appreciate you are giving me this opportunity to share some of my thoughts. I also would appreciate any suggestions and comments from you. You can find my email. Just drop me an email. Thank you.
Very good.
Thank you, Professor Shao.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you, Professor Tang. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.